It is very good to have you, Timothy, after 10 years. I must say you haven't grown older a lot.
Oh, you're lying.
No. You see, I brought the book with the picture, so you can check for yourself. It's, well, I noticed that since 2001 you're not master of the order anymore, but this hasn't changed your life a lot because you are traveling all over the continent.
I've been traveling a lot, yeah, for 20 years now.
Yeah. What do you notice? Is there something changing in the world?
Well, I think obviously when I began to travel, we were dominated by the question of the confrontation of East and West. So the big question was capitalism versus communism. And now, of course, the big question really are two. One is ecology, and we were only beginning to understand the importance of living sustainably 20 years ago. Now it is the first question about the future of the planet. And the second big question, obviously, is the relationship with Islam. That everywhere you go, whether it's in Indonesia, after that I was in Ethiopia. Last week I was in England with a meeting with the General Secretary of the Muslim Council of Great Britain. So you see in every country where you travel, trying to establish friendship with Islam and other religions in Asia, it's the big question.
But isn't it one-sided? Like, for instance, Muslims building mosques in Western Europe, but Christians not being allowed even to reopen their school in Turkey, Orthodox?
That is a big problem, yeah, and it's quite right that we have to insist on more reciprocity. That's certainly correct. Otherwise, we're not caring for the Christian minorities in Islamic countries. So that is absolutely true. But on the other hand, we have to understand why many Muslims are very critical of Western culture. And why they have a defensive reaction against it.
Why is that?
Because I think very often our contemporary culture has wonderful sides and negative sides. I think it has a wonderful freedom, a beautiful tolerance, which I love. There's a lot of creativity, I think, in films and novels. So I think, on the one hand, it's a wonderful time to live in Western culture. But there's another side. I think it's a culture which has lost, if you want, a moral vision. I think seeing everything so often in terms of the market, consumerism, it can be degrading. And so you can understand a Muslim reaction to that. So what we have to do is I think often we have to mediate. We have to mediate between many Muslims in our own Western countries and our culture, helping them to understand what is good, but also understanding their critique of what is destructive or negative.
Do you think that there is a hardening in society, taking both sides, tougher positions?
Unfortunately, it's always easy to find an enemy. And I don't think it's entirely an accident that when communism disappeared as the enemy, we found Islam. So I think we project a lot of fears onto Islam.
On the other hand, they did fly on 9/11 into the towers.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, that's true. And it's also true that there are some parts of Islam which are very militant and aggressive and want to wage a war against the West. That's true. But unfortunately, we're not going to help if we simply put Islam in the place of the enemy.
Do we need an image of the enemy? Do we need an enemy?
Well, nearly all societies look for an enemy. And before communism, For 1,000 years, it was Islam. With the conquest of North Africa, which is an old Christian country. We're coming up through Spain, the advance up as far as Vienna. For centuries, Islam was the enemy outside. And then you have a brief interruption of communism. And now we've returned what is a very old perception of Islam. The threat, often now the enemy inside. But we have to resist that. If you find a scapegoat, then you will kill innocent people. And we have to discover a secure enough identity which doesn't depend upon an enemy. At the heart of Christianity is the belief that Jesus Christ was the innocent scapegoat. Everything was loaded on him. René Girard has shown it's a universal human characteristic, temptation, to find the scapegoat and kill them. And though you're completely right, there are parts of Islam which are very anti-Western, and we must be very aware. There are parts, particularly people influenced by Wahhabi, who tend towards terrorism, but to regard that as the whole of Islam would be untrue and also disastrous.
I read that you are the product of two very rigidly hierarchical institutions, namely the English aristocracy and the Roman Catholic Church. Now, how did you cope with those? You don't seem frustrated.
No, the English, I think in England today, in all honesty, your social background is much less important.
But not when you grew up.
Not when I grew up, no.
You really come from an English aristocratic family?
You could say that, yeah.
Which they drove around with Jaguars instead?
Well, yes.
I read a story about that. Is that true? You wanted to go lift, you wanted to have...
that was a Rolls Royce.
A Rolls Royce. Okay, tell us.
Well, I was staying with my uncle in his house, which was a very big country house with 20, 30 bedrooms, you know. So when I went back to Oxford, he said, when is your train? And I said, but uncle, I'm going by hitchhiking. This is scandalous. So finally his chauffeur in the Rolls Royce delivered me to a spot on the road where I could start hitchhiking. But that's a wonderful liberation, isn't it? But today, Lucette, I think the social background is much less important.
How did you get out of this? Because it seems to me that you could have led a quite easy life.
I think when I first joined the order,
yes,
at the beginning it was a bit difficult because I had never lived closely with people of a different background. So I think they found me a bit odd, and I probably found them a bit odd. But I would say within a month, that was finished. And one of the things that attracted me to the order was that it is classless. You have people of every class. Still to today you do. And I think that in England, the class system was a bit oppressive. And one of the attractive things about becoming a Dominican, and some other orders too, was that you entered a spacious area where anybody could be your friend.
But how do you resolve the tension between tradition and modernity?
I think you have to, if you could imagine the church like a bus, and to hold the bus together, you need what we call a chassis in England. It's the rigid bit underneath which holds the engine and all the chairs and everything in place. Without the chassis, the bus would come to pieces. But when you think of a bus, the most interesting thing is not the chassis. The most interesting thing with a bus is where you travel, who you travel with, what you see. It's the journey and the adventure. Now, I think in the church, the hierarchy is a bit like the chassis. You need it to hold the church together, but it's not very interesting. The interesting thing about being a Catholic is not the hierarchy. The interesting thing is discovering the gospel. It's discovering the wonders of love of God, love of stranger, love of yourself. It's discovering freedom. These are the important things about the church.
But what do you tell people who feel oppressed by the decisions the hierarchy is making?
Well, I would tell them two things. First of all, that we must have confidence to discuss these. And often we underestimate the extent to which members of the hierarchy are open to dialogue. So, okay, we have our opinions. Let us talk. Let us seek together. That's the first thing I would say. Renewal of the church has always come through the laity. Always. Who are the three great patrons of Europe? St. Benedict, St. Francis of Assisi, and St. Catherine of Siena. And what do they have in common? None of them were ordained. Usually vitality in the church has usually or very often been from non-ordained people. So we must have confidence in the vitality of lay people.
A huge topic today in the church is the distinction between the progressives and the conservatives. Now, I know you hate being called a progressive, but aren't you? I mean, what is it that makes us have this distinction?
I think you have to make a distinction, first of all. Some people are temperamentally, psychologically, more conservative and some are more progressive. Some are more fascinated by the past and some are more fascinated by the future. That's a question of psychology. And I think I'm a bit of both, in all honesty. I love tradition. I love history. I love the wealth that we receive from the past, but I also love the future. But that's just a question of temperament. Now, some people become ideologically conservative or ideologically progressive, and that's quite different. When it becomes ideological, you're saying, now I have the truth. I'm a traditionalist. It's all there in my book. Or you can have somebody who is progressive ideologically, and they say, I've got it all. I know the truth, and the past is rubbish. Now that, I think, either of those is unacceptable to Catholics, because we are necessarily traditionalist in that we receive from the past the Gospels, the teaching of the Church. It's filled with richness. I love Augustine. I love St. Thomas Aquinas. And the most creative theologian probably ever was St. Paul. And St. Paul said, what I received, I give to you. St. Paul was creative, but he accepted the tradition. And you could not be a Catholic without being progressive too, because you have to long for the kingdom. You have to long for justice. You have to long for the abolition of suffering. And so somebody who is ideologically traditionalist or ideologically progressive would, I think, be betraying what it means to be Catholic. But always the important question is not, is it progressive or is it conservative? The important question is it true?
How do you know?
Because you study, you think, you pray, and you talk. You study the Gospels, you study the tradition, you pray for illumination, you argue with people hoping you will learn.
But if somebody says, well, I think this is truth, and another person holds another truth, then you say only one truth can exist.
Well, what you see in the Gospels, is Jesus was always, from the beginning, a man of conversation. If you take St. John's Gospel, St. John's Gospel is a sequence of conversations. From Nicodemus, the woman at the well, the blind man, with the disciples at the end, with Pontius Pilate. The whole of the Gospel, you see Jesus engaging in conversation. And that is fundamental to the mission of the church. That's fundamental to the pursuit of truth, is that we converse. Now, some people are nervous about that idea because they say, oh, if you have dialogue, it's relativistic. If it's just dialogue, where's the proclamation? Where's the conversion? But the word we have in English for a sermon is homily. And that means, literally in Greek, conversation. A homily is literally a conversation.
Doesn't look like one inch.
No, it doesn't, Lucette, always. But it has to be, it has to be part of the conversation of the whole church. And if you have a good conversation, you both change. If you have a lively conversation, both will change. I often think of my brother, Pierre Claverie. He engaged all his life in conversation with Islam. And it changed him. He became a better, deeper Christian. And it changed them. Some of them became better Muslims, and some of them became Christians.
Did your image of God change in these years that you were a master of the order?
I think that one loses images of God all the time. Obviously, when you're a child, you think God has got a nice white beard and he sits on the throne. And then you lose that image. And as you get closer to God, you lose more and more images. Probably when I was a young friar, I thought God was a very powerful person. I had to lose that image. It's what we call the via negativa. And it's like if you go to kiss somebody, the closer you get, the less you see. And when you kiss them, you don't see anything at all. So I think that often the spiritual life, you let go one image after another until you see nothing.
Isn't that a kind of void then?
It's,
Can it be depressing?
No, not at all. Quite the opposite. Because I think if all goes well, and the spiritual life is you go up and down, you know, it's not all a steady progress. But I think that what happens when you get close to God is not that you see God, but that you see everything else differently. If you get close to God, if you have friendship with God, then you see things through God's eyes. And so you see the beauty of people more. Suddenly you begin to see the world is filled with beautiful people. And you see their goodness. And you see how, I think it's not unrealistic, but Thomas Merton, after 10 years in the monastery, he went out into the street. He had to leave the monastery to get a little pamphlet printed. And he was struck by everybody. He saw that they were good. And I think that often, at the beginning, we're very judgmental. Particularly when people become Christians. They have a conversion experience, and they are filled with a sense of their own goodness and how wicked everybody else is. But I hope that as they go closer to God, we lose that sense of judgment. And we take pleasure. Because God says to every human being what he said to his son. It's wonderful that you exist.
You wrote a wonderful book about it, in which you point out the links between sexuality and the Eucharist.
For me, that's the only basis of sexual ethics. One of the delicate areas for many young people is sex. And often they want to know what are they allowed to do and what are they not allowed to do. But you can't start understanding sexuality by looking at rules. You have to understand the beauty of sexuality. And for me, the best starting point is when Jesus says, "This is my body and I give it to you." And that's what we say, that's at the heart of sexual ethics, is when two people say to each other, "I give myself to you." That's the whole beauty, which is the mystery of sexuality. But you see also that when they say, "I give myself to you," it's very vulnerable. When Jesus gave himself to his disciples, he was in their hands for whatever they would do with him. And what they did is one of them betrayed him, another denied him, and most of the rest ran away. So one of the first things you learn in sexual ethics is its vulnerability.
Another thing you point out is the dualism, body, soul. You say it is not Christian. A lot of people will think it is. That the church has made a very distinction.
In Western culture, long before Christianity, there were pressures towards dualism. You see it in the time of Plato and Aristotle. So Aristotle was opposing a temptation to dualism which you found hundreds of years before Christianity and resisting it. Then in the 2nd century, you see the temptation of Gnosticism, and much of the battles that Christianity was fighting in the 2nd century were against the dualism of Gnosticism.
Albigensians.
Well, then you get the Manichees in the
Cathars.
4th century, you have the Albigensians in the 13th century. Descartes was a bit tempted towards a dualism of mind and body, and much scientific thought is dualistic today. So I think there has been a constant battle in the West towards dualism.
So it's not something exclusively about religion.
No,
exclusively
no,
something
no.
from religion.
No, I don't think so. I think Christianity has always tried to resist it and has sometimes failed to resist it. Sometimes we have fallen into it. If you take Thomas Aquinas, for example, one of the fascinating things about Aquinas is his insistence on the complete unity of body and soul. You don't have two things, a soul and a body, and they somehow get together. Aquinas has an extraordinary vision of the radical unity of the human person.
St. John Chrysostom had a speech in which he told people that about the sacredness of sex. Isn't that quite unbelievable for a Christian saint to tell his audience?
Oh, well, I hope not. I mean, we go back to the Song of Songs in the Bible. It's very erotic. And that's, people have always recognized the continuity between, if you want, the human erotic and our relationship with God. And if you read the first encyclical of the Pope, Deus Caritas Est, the first thing that the Pope insists on is the unity of the erotic love and Christian love. He says they are one love. And I think one of the reasons why people trivialize sex is they take erotic out of it. It becomes mechanical, impersonal, like cleaning your teeth, boring.
But how come then that previous generations, the generation of my parents, my grandparents, have all had another teaching which was very oppressive?
I think that from the 17th century, You see, if you go back to the medievals, you don't have a negative teaching about sex at all.
In Christianity, no?
No. If you look at Dante's vision in the Inferno, in hell, the least grave sins were the sexual ones, because they were seeking a good but wrongly. The big sins for the Middle Ages, for Dante and for Aquinas and people like that, the big sins were telling lies, falsehood, because that destroys human community. Human community is founded on the truth. So in the medieval vision, what was really fundamental was that we live together in truth. Now, also in the Middle Ages, they knew we were animals. Aquinas says we are rational animals. In the big 17th century, we begin to think we're not animals, you know. Animals become other things. We are minds. And then you get a movement towards dualism, and then I think you get a lot of suspicion of sex. Of course, it's a more complex story than that.
Timothy, the book you wrote, The 7 Lost Words, is about the crosses you received. What's your favorite cross?
Well, that one there, the cross of the rosary, there I have it on me, and I love that one. But the one I most love is from Haiti. I have that in my room upstairs, and it shows a man on pilgrimage, you see, a Haitian peasant, and it is dark, but there is the dawn, and he's walking towards the sun, and I think that's always a cross for a pilgrim. Often you're traveling at night, you know, you're stuck in an airport, they've cancelled the plane, and you're wondering where you're going and what you're doing. But this is a good cross for travelers. It shows always the dawn comes. And there's always light in the end.
Thank you very much, Timothy, for sharing your views with us. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we can make an appointment for the next 10 years.